A third reason was that an attack against the Netherlands East Indies sector would remedy the current comparative inactivity of the Australian troops. Operations in the New Guinea area did not require the full capabilities of the Australian forces, and until final decisions were made regarding the employment of forces for the invasion of Japan, the Borneo sector furnished ideal action targets. A specific proposal to undertake operations in the Netherlands East Indies had been made in the summer of 1944, when the British suggested establishing a separate Commonwealth task force under a British commander. This plan contemplated removing Australia, the Indies, and Borneo from General MacArthur's command once the forces of the Southwest Pacific area had been established in the Philippines. The British forces involved would then operate independently of General MacArthur. The proposal was made originally to the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, at a Dominion conference in London. Mr. Curtin, however, recommended that the plan be rejected because of the existing Allied and Australian arrangements relating to command in the Southwest Pacific area. He emphasised that Australian naval, land and air units were included in the forces available to implement Allied strategy in the Pacific and were assigned to the Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific area. He warned of potential misunderstandings with the United States if the Australians were taken from General MacArthur's command and placed under an Empire commander. There was a tradition of successful collaboration between the Australian government and General MacArthur's headquarters, and the Australian Prime Minister opposed any change except upon recommendation of the combined Chiefs of Staff with the consent of the Australian government. General MacArthur was in full accord with the Joint Chiefs of Staff's suggestion to accept all the British and Dominion forces that could be made available for use in the Pacific. However, he was completely opposed to any proposition that might restrict how he would employ these forces. He emphasised that no steps should be taken that would impose unjustifiable limitations upon his conduct of operations or unduly complicate existing command channels. In a radio to the War Department on the 27th of August 1944, General MacArthur stated, "To attempt to segregate such a force into an entirely self-contained command consisting of ground, naval and air components would not only introduce a clash of command authority, but would require the complete reorganization of the present setup, wherein the Australian, New Zealand and American forces are amalgamated along service lines and coordinated under my immediate control." He also stressed that, except under exceptional circumstances, British or Dominion forces would serve under their respective commanders and would be given independent missions. However, he reiterated that coordination of all ground, naval and air forces should remain under his control. To conduct the campaigns in the Netherlands East Indies, General MacArthur decided to use the Australian I Corps. The 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions would be moved into the Hollandia-Morotai area to be staged for assaults along the coasts of Borneo. Logistic factors made it impossible to execute these plans without some modifications. Difficulties arose in obtaining the necessary shipping to support the scheduled operations. In reply to a request for 48 cargo vessels, General MacArthur was advised that no additional tonnage was available. There were, however, 10 trans-Pacific troop ships on hand that could be employed. These ships, along with a change in the program for moving surplus supplies, service units and bases from Australia, New Guinea and other points in the South Pacific to the Philippines, provided a partial solution to the problem. To cut shipping requirements further, the original plan for moving the Australian troops was also changed. Only one division and a proportionate share of Corps troops would be moved in heavy shipping. The remainder would be transported in amphibious craft. An initial schedule was established that called for the occupation of Tarakan Island off the northeast coast of Borneo on the 29th of April 1945 to provide land-based air support for subsequent operations against Balikpapan. The assault against Balikpapan, farther south on the same coast, would be launched on the 22nd of May, while the move into the Banjarmasin area of southeastern Borneo was set for the 1st of June. Air power based on Banjarmasin would, in turn, support the attack against Surabaya, set for the 30th of June. If British carriers were available for support at this time, Surabaya would be bypassed, and the amphibious forces would strike directly at Batavia. The campaign would conclude with one task force driving through Java and then through the remaining islands of the Indies within the Southwest Pacific area, while a second task force moved up to occupy British North Borneo. Additional changes were required when it was decided not to relieve the Australian 6th Division from its task of reducing Japanese remnants in New Guinea. Lieutenant General Sir Leslie Morshed, commanding Australian War Corps, was ordered to carry out the Tarakan and Balikpapan operations, using only the 7th and 9th Divisions. Priority was also given to capturing the Brunei Bay area in British North Borneo, as this region would provide an excellent advance base for the British Pacific Fleet and serve as a source of raw rubber, a critical commodity. New operations instructions were issued, incorporating these latest modifications. The Tarakan assault was moved back to the 1st of May. Brunei Bay was scheduled for attack on the 10th of June, and the Balikpapan operations were set back 5 weeks to the 1st of July. Approximately 600 miles wide and 800 miles long, Borneo is the largest and one of the most sparsely populated islands in the Netherlands East Indies. The interior's topography is hilly and mountainous, with the entire island covered in large tropical rainforests and swamps. Mechanized movement is virtually impossible, except in small areas located mainly along the coast. During the early years of the war, Borneo was vital to the Japanese, both economically and militarily. The enemy's selection of the northern oil fields as invasion points in 1942 indicated the emphasis placed on Borneo's petroleum supply. It was estimated that during 1943 and 1944, this rich island supplied 40% of Japan's fuel oil and 25 to 30% of her crude and heavy oils. Borneo's principal oil fields were located in the region of Samarinda on the east coast, on the island of Tarakan, and between Miri and Seria at the northern boundary of Sarawak on the west coast. In addition to its resources, the island occupied a strategic position on Japan's southern shipping lanes. Borneo's coasts were bordered by the two most important north-south sea routes off Southeast Asia, the South China Sea to the west and Makassar Strait to the east. The Java Sea to the south provided east-west access to key ports throughout the Indies and to Malaya, Burma and Thailand. Bases and harbours on the island's coasts served as staging, fueling and transfer points for ships and planes moving along the lifelines of Japan's empire. During the first months of 1945, the Japanese regrouped and shifted their forces to prepare the island for defence against an anticipated Allied attack. The firm and extensive occupation of Borneo by the Japanese made the procurement of intelligence an extremely difficult task, requiring great care in sending Allied intelligence agents into the area. Despite the many handicaps, much valuable information on enemy strength and dispositions was collected from agents of the Allied Intelligence Bureau and other G2 sources. During February, March and April 1945, the estimates of enemy forces in the Borneo area remained fairly static, listing an aggregate of 25,000 to 30,000 troops from the Japanese 37th Army and miscellaneous naval units. Beginning their largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, Australian troops sailed from Morotai on the 27th of April to launch the opening attack against Tarakan Island off the northeast coast of Borneo. The assault against this island was the initial step in the oboe operations of the overall Montclair Plan. By assaulting the important oil port of Tarakan, the Australians would strike their first blow to regain the rich colonial empire seized by the Japanese during the dark days of January 1942. At that time, the oil storage tanks on Tarakan had been fired by the Dutch in a desperate effort to prevent their advantageous use by the invaders. Now, those same tanks, having been rebuilt by the Japanese, vanished in smoke and flame, this time under the bombardment of American and Australian manned liberators. Backed by aerial assault and the devastating firepower of a naval task force composed of United States and Australian cruisers and destroyers, the Tarakan Attack Group under Rear ADM. Forrest B. Royal arrived unopposed off Tarakan on the morning of May. The reinforced 26th Infantry Brigade of the Australian 9th Division and a battalion of the Royal Netherlands Indies Army assailed the elaborate system of Japanese defences at Linkas, southeast of the Tarakan airdrome. Additional support was provided by artillery fire from Sadao Island, approximately 6 miles up the coast, which had been previously occupied by Australian commandos. 3 days were spent prior to the assault in sweeping the waters for mines under the protective cover of naval guns. Steel rails embedded in mud near the shore and underwater barbed wire entanglements formed an additional obstacle that was extremely hazardous to move through. Depth charges, landmines buried on the shore, and oil pipes emplaced to spurt flame and smoke all helped to form an elaborate and destructive beach defence. The communiqué of the 3rd of May detailed the importance of the Tarakan move. Australian ground forces from one of its most famous divisions, veterans of New Guinea and the Middle East, have landed on the key island of Tarakan, off the eastern coast of Borneo. Following immense air attacks by Royal Australian and Far East Air Forces and a 4-day naval bombardment by units of the United States 7th Fleet and the Royal Australian Navy, our troops in amphibious tanks and fast landing craft swept ashore near Linkas, 2 miles east of Tarakan airfield. A beachhead was quickly established before the enemy garrison could offer effective opposition, and our troops are advancing toward the airfield and town. There has been no enemy air or naval reaction. Earlier denied the fruits of his rich Borneo oil and rubber conquests by our air and submarine blockade, his actual possession is now directly challenged. This operation virtually severs the enemy's holdings in the south. His forces in the eastern portion of the Netherlands East Indies, including the Celebes, Moluccas, Lesser Sundas, and other island outposts, are effectively isolated. The establishment of this base will complete our chain of airfields extending from Luzon in the north to Darwin in the south, and enable our bombers to strike at will the enemy's forces anywhere in the Southwest Pacific Theatre and constantly interdict his lines of supply and communication. Enemy shipping in these waters will be hunted down and destroyed, as it has already been in the China Sea. Although strong enemy defence measures delayed the landing, they failed to repel it. The Australians went ashore at several places along the beach near Linkas as the Japanese withdrew to prepared inland positions. Aided by precision bombing from the liberators and strong tank support, the Australian troops drove toward the island airfield. However, as they approached Tarakan town, they began to meet increasingly fierce resistance. Heavy machine gun and mortar fire from a labyrinth of interconnecting tunnels and pillboxes opposed their advance. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting broke out along the ridges and in the jungle, with fanatic kamikaze charges made by the Japanese defenders as they counter-attacked with savage determination. Despite this strong enemy reaction, the Australians, through envelopment from the southeast and northwest, secured the Tarakan airstrip by the 6th of May. The Japanese were driven into the hills east of the airfield, where they fell back on well-prepared ground to continue a dogged resistance. Tanks blasted the Japanese from their holes and trenches, while repeated infantry attacks reduced their defences to small individual pockets. Supported by planes, tanks, artillery and flamethrowers, the Australians pushed onward and soon captured the heavily damaged Juata and Sesanip oil fields. Cape Juata and nearby Boenjo Island were cleared, and by the end of the month the remaining Japanese had retreated into the central mountains of the island, where they stubbornly resisted all attempts to dislodge them. Attack after attack was made against the numerous pillboxes and honeycombs of tunnels along the crests and ridges, but despite constant shelling and bombing attacks, the Japanese clung desperately to their positions. In early June, these positions were subjected to low-level air attacks, in which incendiary belly tanks were dropped to burn out the remaining enemy troops. By the 21st of June, all organised Japanese resistance on Tarakan had ceased. 5 weeks after the Tarakan invasion, the Australians launched their second blow against Borneo. Furthering General MacArthur's plan to segment the Japanese forces in the Netherlands East Indies, the Brunei Attack Group, under Admiral Royal, left Morotai on the 4th of June to secure the great naval base at Brunei Bay on the western coast of British North Borneo. Arriving off the objective area 6 days later, The powerful Allied task force poured a heavy concentration of shells and bombs on the enemy's beach defences. There was complete integration of United States and Australian naval forces, Australian ground forces, and United States and Australian air forces as the 20th and 24th Brigades of the Australian 9th Division swept ashore simultaneously on Labuan and Muara Islands and at Brookerton, just north of Brunei. The communiqué of the 12th of June described the strategic value of the objective. The Brunei area is rich in oil, rubber, coal, lumber, and other resources, and in the 500 square miles of its sheltered bay, numerous ships of any size can ride at anchor. The establishment of air and naval facilities at Brunei, combined with those in the Philippines, will complete a chain of mutually supporting strategic bases 1,500 miles long, from which naval and air forces are within continuous effective range of the Asiatic coast from Singapore to Shanghai. Operations from the Philippine bases have already practically destroyed enemy shipping in the South China Sea, and we shall now be able to interdict his lines of communication and escape routes in Indochina and Malaya. At Brunei and Tarakan, our columns stand not at the gates, but at the geographical centre of the enemy-occupied Celebes, Bali, Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Indochina. His garrisons there can now only await piecemeal destruction at will. With his conquest in the East Indies cut off and isolated from the Empire, the rich resources rendered valueless, his naval and air arms in the Indies impotent, and his ground troops immobilized and unable to obtain reinforcements or supplies, the enemy invader has definitely lost the war of strategy in the Southwest Pacific. General MacArthur personally supervised the successful landings on Labuan Island and, together with General Morshead, Australian One Corps commander, and General Kenny, commander of Allied air forces, went ashore with the assault waves. "Rarely is such a great strategic prize obtained at such low cost," General MacArthur commented when he observed the success of the initial landings. Labuan, Victoria Town, was virtually destroyed by a naval bombardment 3 times greater than that which had been visited upon Tarakan. Japanese beach defences lay shattered, and only a few scattered parties of dazed enemy troops attempted to offer any resistance. The main opposition to the inland movement came in the form of glutinous mud, which impeded infantry and vehicles alike. By nightfall, however, the Australians held the ruined town and the bomb-devastated airstrip. By the 15th of June, all organised resistance had been terminated on Labuan Island. On Brunei Peninsula, the advance southward proceeded rapidly. By the 12th of June, Australian troops had secured Brunei airfield. The town of Brunei fell the next day after a swift march along the Cape and an amphibious movement across Brunei Bay. The Japanese had beaten a hasty retreat, and only feeble counteraction met the Australian forces. Accompanying the Australian troops into Brunei were members of the British North Borneo Administration Unit, who were charged with restoring civil administration in the liberated areas of British Borneo and administering to the general welfare of the native population of Labuan and Brunei Peninsula. Positions in and around Brunei were consolidated, and the drive continued southwest along the coast. Tutong, an oil refinery centre located 35 miles south of Brunei Bay, was captured on the 17th of June. Meanwhile, a new and easy landing was effected by 9th Division troops at the port of Weston on the eastern shore of Brunei Bay. On the 19th of June, in the wake of an artillery bombardment from Labuan Island, 9th Division units in a shore-to-shore move landed at Mempakul, on the northeast shore of Brunei Bay. This unopposed landing gave the Australians complete control of the shores bordering both entrances into the bay. At the same time, the elements that had landed at Weston were pressing toward Beaufort, the strategic centre on the single-track railway to Jesselton. He thought that these steps should introduce immediate landings by strong, coordinated ground and air forces of the army, fully prepared to overcome any potential opposition. General MacArthur believed that naval forces were not designed to effect the preliminary occupation of a hostile country, whose ground divisions were still intact, and contended that the occupation of large land areas involved operations that were fundamentally and basically a mission of the army. The occupation, he maintained, should proceed along sound tactical lines, with each branch of the service performing its appropriate mission. General MacArthur felt also that, in the event landings by light naval units were authorized, Army troops should go ashore at the same time to implement the display of force. Occupation by a weak Allied force might encourage opposition from dissident Japanese elements among the bomb-shattered population and lead to grave repercussions. In a radio to Washington, General MacArthur declared, "I hold the firm belief that sound military judgment dictates that the occupation should be effected in force in order to impose our will upon the enemy and to avoid incidents which might develop serious proportions." The Blacklist Plan therefore provided for a coordinated movement of ground, naval, and air forces, and a gradual but firmly regulated occupation. The final edition of Blacklist, issued on the 8th of August, was divided into 3 main phases of successive occupation. Phase 1, Kanto Plain, Nagasaki Sasebo, Kobe Osaka Kyoto, Seoul, Korea, and Aogen JTG Omitlato. Phase 2, Shimonoseki Fukuoka, Nagoya, Sapporo, Hokkaido, and Fusan, Korea. Phase 3, Hiroshima Kure, Kochi, Shikoku, Okarama, Tsuruga, Glomar, Karafuto, Sendai, Nijigala, and Gyu-zd, 71 Zushu, Korea. These major strategic areas of Japan and Korea would be seized to isolate Japan from Asia, immobilize enemy armed forces, and initiate action against any recalcitrant elements. Thus, the projected occupations would permit close direction of the political, economic, and military institutions of the 2 countries. Other areas would be occupied as deemed necessary by army commanders to accomplish their missions. To lend additional force to the terms of the Potsdam Ultimatum, the air and naval offensive was stepped up with even greater power. B-29S from the Marianas, supported by fighters based on Iwo Jima, averaged 1,200 sorties a week over the enemy's homeland, while planes from Okinawa airfields ripped his positions on the Asiatic mainland and destroyed what remained of his shipping. The Third Fleet and its attached British units, meanwhile, roamed Japanese waters, shelling coastal cities and shore targets with impunity. In an effort to minimize the losses among the civilian population and to counteract false propaganda concerning Allied aims spread by the Japanese High Command, the 20th Air Force and the Far East Air Forces on the 28th of July began dropping warning leaflets to announce 72 hours in advance the names of the cities marked for destruction. In addition to notifying all civilians to flee to safety, the leaflets advised them to restore peace by demanding new and good leaders who will end the war. As a direct consequence of the failure of the Japanese government to accept promptly the terms of the Potsdam Proclamation, Japan became the victim of the most destructive and revolutionary weapon in the long history of warfare, the atom bomb. The first bomb of this type ever used against an enemy was released early on the 6th of August from an American superfortress over the military base city of Hiroshima and exploded with incomparable and devastating force. The city was almost completely and uniformly leveled. On the 7th of August, President Truman electrified the world with a broadcast statement that declared, 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake, we shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. With the echo of this cataclysmic explosion reverberating around the world, another staggering blow befell the Japanese. The Soviet Union on the 8th of August declared war on Japan and hastily sent troops against the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The Japanese were now assailed from every side. On the 9th of August, a second atomic bomb destroyed the city of Nagasaki amid a cloud of dust and debris that rose 50,000 feet and was visible for more than 75 miles. The two bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dropped by the 509th Composite Bomb Group based on Tinian. The selection of Nagasaki as the second objective of the atomic bomb was caused by unfavorable weather conditions. After circling for 50 minutes above the smoke-obscured city of Kokura, which was the primary target, the bombing plane flew on to drop the bomb over Nagasaki, the alternate target. The advent of the atomic bomb, coming on the heels of a long series of paralyzing military disasters, hastened the surrender that was already being intensively deliberated by Japan's leaders. By the 10th of August, Japan had had enough. She recognized her situation as hopeless. After much internal struggle and argument, the Japanese government instructed its minister to Switzerland to advise the United States through the Swiss government that the terms of the Potsdam Ultimatum would be accepted if Japan's national polity could be preserved. The Japanese note read in part, "The Japanese government several weeks ago asked the Soviet government, with which neutral relations then prevailed, to render good offices in restoring peace with the enemy power. Unfortunately, these efforts in the interest of peace having failed, the Japanese government, in conformity with the august wish of His Majesty, to restore the general peace, and desiring to put an end to the world sufferings entailed by war as quickly as possible, has decided upon the following. The Japanese government is ready to accept the terms enumerated in the joint declaration which was issued at Potsdam on July 26, 1945, by the heads of the governments of the United States, Great Britain, and China, and later subscribed by the Soviet government, with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. The Japanese government sincerely hopes that this understanding is warranted and desires keenly that an explicit indication to that effect will be speedily forthcoming." On the 11th of August, the United States, acting on behalf of the United Nations, transmitted a reply which stated, "From the moment of surrender, the authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme command of the Allied powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the surrender terms. The Emperor will be required to authorize and ensure the signature by the Government of Japan and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters of the surrender terms necessary to carry out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration, and shall issue his commands to all the Japanese military, naval, and air authorities, and to all the forces under their control, wherever located, to cease active operations, and to surrender their arms, and to issue such other orders as the Supreme Commander may require to give effect to the surrender terms. Immediately upon the surrender, the Japanese government shall transport prisoners of war and civilian internees to places of safety as directed, where they can quickly be placed aboard Allied transports. The ultimate form of government of Japan shall, in accordance with the Potsdam Declaration, be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. The armed forces of the Allied powers will remain in Japan until the purposes set forth in the Potsdam Declaration are achieved." While the Japanese government pondered the Allied answer, President Truman, on the 12th of August, directed the Strategic Air Force to cease its attacks. The Far East Air Forces and the Allied fleet in Japanese waters, however, continued their steady pounding. When no reply was received from the Japanese by the 13th of August, the Strategic Air Force was ordered to renew its operations, and on the same day, 1,000 carrier planes from the Third Fleet made their final raid on Tokyo. Never before in history had one nation been the target of such concentrated air power. In the last 15 days of the war, the 5th and 7th Air Forces flew 6,372 sorties against Kyushu alone. 49% of this devastating effort was directed at manufacturing areas and docks. The remaining percentage was divided among enemy shipping, air installations, and lines of communication. Thus, with a deafening crescendo of blasting bombs, the Far East Air Forces culminated their blows against Japan. During the last 7.5 months of the war, their planes had destroyed or badly damaged 2,846,932 tons of shipping and 1,375 enemy aircraft, dropped 100,000 tons of bombs, and flown over 50,000 sorties. The end of the war in Europe had not only released additional ground, air, and naval forces for the war against Japan, but had also enabled the Soviet Union to mass its forces for an attack upon Manchuria and northern China. The veteran armies of General MacArthur were poised and ready for an invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. The warning to surrender or be destroyed had not been composed of idle words. Stark and ruinous defeat was. While Japan considered its final acceptance of the Allied terms, preparations for the progressive occupation of its cities and military possessions were already completed. The formal directive for the occupation of Japan, Korea, and the China coast was issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the 11th of August. Arrangements for the peaceful entry of Allied forces were patterned as far as practicable upon the actual invasion plans. The immediate objectives were the early introduction of occupying forces into major strategic areas, the control of critical ports, port facilities and airfields, and the demobilization and disarmament of enemy troops. First priority was given to the prompt occupation of Japan, second to the consolidation of Keijo in Korea, and third to the operations on the China coast and in Formosa. General MacArthur was to assume responsibility for the forces entering Japan and Korea. General WWII was assigned operational control of the forces landing on the China coast and was instructed to coordinate his plans with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Naval forces entering ports in Japan and China were to remain under the command of Admiral Nimitz until General MacArthur and General WWII could take over these areas. Japanese forces in Southeast Asia were earmarked for surrender to Admiral Mountbatten, those in China to Generalissimo Chiang, and those in the Russian area of operations to the Soviet High Command in the Far East. Final authority for the execution of the terms of surrender and for the occupation of Japan would rest with a supreme commander for the Allied powers. The British, Soviet, and Chinese governments concurred in President Truman's proposal that General MacArthur be designated supreme commander to assume the overall administration of the surrender. The 15th of August was an eventful date in history. It was the day Japan's notification of final surrender was received in the United States. It was the day President Truman announced the end of conflict in the Pacific. It was the day the Emperor of Japan made a dramatic and unprecedented broadcast to his people. It was the day that General MacArthur was made supreme commander for the Allied powers. The Japanese acceptance of the terms laid down by the Allies at Potsdam read in part, His Majesty the Emperor has issued an imperial rescript regarding Japan's acceptance of the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration. His Majesty the Emperor is prepared to authorize and ensure the signature by his government and the Imperial General Headquarters of the necessary terms for carrying out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration. His Majesty is also prepared to issue his commands to all the military, naval, and air authorities of Japan and all the forces under their control wherever located to cease active operations, to surrender arms, and to issue such orders as may be required by the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces for the execution of the above-mentioned terms. As soon as the note of acceptance was received, President Truman announced Japan's capitulation to the world and at the same time ordered that all offensive operations against Japan be suspended. In Japan, meanwhile, the Emperor was making an unprecedented nationwide broadcast of the imperial rescript of surrender, informing the Japanese of their country's first military defeat and exhorting them to unite in peace for the construction of the future. After pondering deeply the general trend of the world situation and the actual state of our empire, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present crisis by resort to an extraordinary measure. To our good and loyal subjects we hereby convey our will. We have commanded our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the terms of their joint declaration. Hostilities have now continued for nearly 4 years. Despite the gallant fighting of the officers and men of our army and navy, the diligence and loyal service of our 100 million subjects, despite the best efforts of all, the war has not necessarily developed in our favour, and the general world situation also is not to Japan's advantage. Should we continue to fight, the ultimate result would be not only the obliteration of the race, but the extinction of human civilization. Then how should we be able to lead the millions of our subjects and make atonement to the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? That is why we have commanded the imperial government during the unendurable and bearing the unbearable to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. Since it has been possible to preserve the structure of the imperial state, we shall always be with ye, our good and loyal subjects, placing our trust in your sincerity and integrity. Beware most strictly of any outburst of emotion which may engender needless complications, and refrain from fraternal contention and strife which may create confusion, lest ye unwittingly cause ye to lose the confidence of the world. Let the nation continue as one family from generation to generation, with unwavering faith in the imperishability of our divine land, and ever mindful of its heavy burden of responsibility and the long road ahead. Turn your full strength to the task of building a new future. Cultivate the ways of rectitude, foster nobility of spirit, and work with resolution so that ye may enhance the innate glory of the imperial state and keep pace with the progress of the world. We charge ye, our loyal subjects, to carry out faithfully our will. To initiate the steps towards the implementation of the surrender terms, President Truman announced the appointment of General MacArthur as the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers and dispatched the following orders to the Japanese government. You are to proceed as follows. Direct prompt cessation of hostilities by Japanese forces, informing the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers of the effective date and hour of such cessation. Send emissaries at once to the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, with information of the disposition of the Japanese forces and commanders, and fully empowered to make any arrangements directed by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers to enable him and his accompanying forces to arrive at the place designated by him to receive the formal surrender. For the purpose of receiving such surrender and carrying it into effect, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur has been designated as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, and he will notify the Japanese government of the time, place, and other details of the formal surrender. From the War Department in Washington, the Army Chief of Staff dispatched a message to General MacArthur which read, Your directive as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers is effective with the receipt of this message. General MacArthur received the announcement of Japan's capitulation with an expression of deep gratitude. I thank a merciful God that this mighty struggle is about to end. I shall at once take steps to stop hostilities and further bloodshed. The magnificent men and women who have fought so nobly to victory can now return to their homes in due course and resume their civil pursuits. They have been good soldiers in war. May they be equally good citizens in peace. The airwaves crackled with urgent radio messages between Manila headquarters and Tokyo. General MacArthur notified the Emperor and the Japanese government on the 15th of August that he had been designated Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, and was authorized to arrange for the cessation of hostilities at the earliest practicable date. Accordingly, he directed that the Japanese forces terminate hostilities immediately, and that he be notified at once of the effective date and hour of such termination. He further directed that Japan send to Manila on the 17th of August a competent representative empowered to receive in the name of the Emperor of Japan, the Japanese Imperial Government, and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters certain requirements for carrying into effect the terms of surrender. General MacArthur's stipulations to the Japanese government included specific instructions regarding the journey of the Japanese representatives to Manila. The emissaries were to leave Satamisaki on the southern tip of Kyushu on the morning of the 17th of August. They were instructed to travel in a Douglas DC-3 type transport plane, painted white and marked with green crosses on the wings and fuselage, and to fly under Allied escort to an airdrome on Ieshima in the Ryukyus. From there, the Japanese would be transported to Manila in a United States plane. The code designation chosen for communication between the Japanese plane and United States forces was the symbolic word bataan. On the evening of the 16th, General MacArthur was notified that the Emperor of Japan had issued an order at 1600 that day, commanding the entire armed forces of his nation to halt their fighting immediately. The wide dispersion and disrupted communications of the Japanese forces, however, made the rapid and complete implementation of such an order exceedingly difficult. As the Japanese apologetically explained, the imperial order would take approximately 2 to 12 days to reach Japanese forces throughout the Pacific and Asiatic areas. But whether and when the order will be received by the first line is difficult to foresee. The radio also stated that members of the imperial family were being sent to Japan's numerous theatres of operations as personal representatives of the emperor to expedite and ensure full compliance with the imperial order to cease hostilities. The departure of the delegates for the Manila negotiations, the Japanese continued, would be slightly delayed, as it is impossible for us to arrange for the flight of our representatives on the 17th of August due to the scarcity of time allowed us. The radio added, however, that preparations were being made with all possible speed, and that General MacArthur would be immediately informed of the rescheduled flight date. A second message from the Japanese government on the 16th described the tentative itineraries of the imperial emissaries who were being dispatched by air to the various fronts. General MacArthur replied that the signing of the surrender terms would not be among the tasks of the Japanese representatives dispatched to Manila. General MacArthur's headquarters assured the Japanese that their intended measures were satisfactory and promised that every precaution would be taken to ensure the safety of the Emperor's representatives on their missions. Further instructions were issued regarding the type of plane to be used in sending the Japanese to Manila, but authorization was given to change the type of plane if necessary. On the 16th of August, Japan's leaders announced that their delegates had been selected and would leave Tokyo for Manila on the 19th of August. It was now only a matter of days before the long-awaited moment of final surrender would become a reality. Another communication from the Japanese on the 16th asked for clarification of the phrase, "certain requirements for carrying into effect the terms of surrender." Headed by Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Vice Chief of the Army General Staff, the 16-man Japanese delegation on the morning of the 19th of August boarded 2 white green-crossed disarmed Navy medium bombers and departed secretly from Kisarazu Airdrome on the eastern shore of Tokyo Bay. After landing at Iishima, according to General MacArthur's instructions, the Japanese passengers were immediately transferred to a U.S. Army transport plane and landed on Nichols Field south of Manila at about 1800 that same day. On hand to meet the Japanese envoys as they emerged from the plane was a party of linguist officers headed by General Willoughby, General MacArthur's wartime director of intelligence. Following the necessary introductions and identifications, the Japanese were taken immediately to temporary quarters on Manila's Dewey Boulevard to await the meetings scheduled for that evening. Less than 3 hours after their arrival, the 16-man Japanese delegation was led by General Willoughby to the first of 2 conferences held that night with members of General MacArthur's staff. General MacArthur himself was not present. As the solemn procession moved from Dewey Boulevard through the battered and war-torn streets of Manila and up the broad steps of the City Hall, the stone-faced Japanese officers in their beribboned grey-green uniforms, with their peculiarly peaked caps and with their 2-handed samurai swords dangling from their waists almost to the ground, made a grim and curious picture. Shortly after 2100, the Japanese and American representatives entered General Chamberlain's office and sat down facing each other across the long black table of the map-covered conference room. The meetings continued through the night of the 19th and into the next day. As General Sutherland led the discussions, linguists busily scanned, translated, and photostated the various reports, maps, and charts that the Japanese had brought with them. Allied translator and interpreter section personnel worked throughout the night to put General MacArthur's requirements into accurate Japanese before morning. It was a matter of vital importance that all documents be capably and correctly translated, so that arrangements for surrender could be completed with a minimum of misunderstanding and a maximum of speed. The conference proceeded smoothly, and all major problems were resolved satisfactorily. Results of the negotiations made it advisable to modify some of the original concepts on the problem of occupation. Based upon the full cooperation of the Japanese government and Imperial General Headquarters, the new modifications provided for gradual occupation of designated areas after the Japanese had disarmed the local troops. No direct demilitarization was to be carried out by Allied personnel. The Japanese were to control the disarmament and demobilization of their own armed forces under Allied supervision. General Kawabe expressed his belief that the Japanese would faithfully carry out all Allied demands, but because of the unpredictable reactions of the Japanese civilian and army elements, he requested that Japan be given an additional period of preparation before the actual steps of occupation were taken. General Sutherland allowed 3 extra days. The target date for the initial landings was postponed from the 25th of August to the 28th of August. The arrival of the advance unit at Atsugi Airfield was scheduled for the 26th of August. At the close of the conference, General Kawabe was handed the documents containing the requirements of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. These directives stipulated General MacArthur's requirements concerning the arrival of the first echelons of the Allied forces, the formal surrender ceremony, and the subsequent reception of the occupation forces. Also given to General Kawabe were a draft of the imperial proclamation by which the Emperor would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and command his subjects to cease hostilities, a copy of General Order No. 1 by which Imperial General Headquarters would direct all military and naval commanders to lay down their arms and surrender their units to designated Allied commanders, and lastly the instrument of surrender itself, which would later be signed on board an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. The Manila Conference was over. The Japanese delegation left at 1300 on the 20th of August and started back to Japan along the same route by which it had come. The homeward trip, however, was marred by an accident which caused a few anxious moments to the bearers of the surrender documents. The plane carrying the key emissaries had to make a forced landing on a beach near Hamamatsu, and it was not until 7 hours after their scheduled time of return that the members of the mission were able to report the results of the Manila Conference to their waiting premier. It now remained for Japan to prepare itself to carry out the provisions of surrender and to accept a peaceful military occupation of the homeland by Allied forces. General MacArthur anticipated that, subject to weather conditions which would permit the necessary air and naval operations, the instrument of surrender would be signed within 10 days. "It is my earnest hope," he announced after the departure of Japan's representatives from Manila, "that pending the formal accomplishment of the instrument of surrender, armistice conditions may prevail on every front, and that bloodless surrender may be effectuated." Simultaneously with President Truman's announcement of Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, a thorough reorganization of AFPAC forces was effected in preparation for the forthcoming Allied mission in Japan. On the 15th of August, General MacArthur ordered sweeping changes to strengthen 6th and 8th Armies and 44 Corps, then with 10th Army in the Ryukyus for their imminent duties of occupation. The 11th Airborne Division had moved 800 miles by air with full combat equipment from Luzon to Okinawa in a record time of 44 hours and had already passed to the control of General Eichelberger's 8th Army. 8th Army, which would institute the occupation unassisted until the 22nd of September, was also given control of 12th Corps with the Americal, 1st Cavalry, and 43rd Divisions, and the 112th Regimental Combat Team, 9 Corps with the 77th and 81st Divisions, and the 158th Regimental Combat Team, and the 27th Division on Okinawa. In addition, 8th Army included 14th Corps, the 31st Division, and the 368th Regimental Combat Team, taken from X Corps, and the 40th Division, taken from 6th Army. General Kruger's 6th Army was meanwhile increased by the addition of V Amphibious Corps, with its 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Marine Divisions located in Saipan, Oahu, Guam, and Hawaii. General Kruger also assumed command of X Corps, with the 24th and 41st Divisions, the 6th Division from 8th Army, and the 98th Division from AF Midpac were also transferred to 6th Army. What April 4 Corps on Okinawa passed from 10th Army to the direct control of AFPAC to operate independently as the occupation force in Korea, south of the 38-degree parallel. General MacArthur assigned the responsibility for the security of the Ryukyus to Army Service Command 1, ASCOM-Y, and directed AFWESPAC to assume combat responsibilities in the Southwest Pacific area. Lieutenant General Wilhelm D. Steyer, commanding general of AFWESPAC, established two commands to maintain security in the Philippines: the Luzon Area Command and the Southern Islands Area Command. The former SWPA commands, Allied Land Forces, Allied Naval Forces, and Allied Air Forces, were to be abolished with the signing of the surrender terms, at which time control of the southern portion of the Southwest Pacific area would pass to the British. As the day of formal surrender drew near, all available troop transports of the Far East Air Forces and dozens of the huge Sky Trains and Skymasters of the Pacific Air Transport Command were massed at Okinawa to airlift the first occupation forces to Japan in the greatest aerial movement of the Pacific War. On the 26th of August, General Eichelberger transferred the 8th Army command post from the eastern coastal plain of Leyte to Okinawa and prepared to lead the vanguard forces of the 11th Airborne and 27th Infantry Divisions onto Japanese soil. At this critical juncture, however, a typhoon raging through the Japanese home islands caused a delay in Japan's final preparations to receive the occupation forces and resulted in a 2-day postponement of the preliminary landings, originally scheduled for the 26th of August. The first American landings in Japan were made at 0900 on the 28th of August by a small airborne advance party of 50 communications experts and engineers. Deplaning at the large Navy airfield at Atsugi, some 20 miles southwest of Tokyo, the daring little group fell immediately to the task of setting up the communications and other operational facilities for the swarms of 4-engined planes that would bring the 11th Airborne Division to establish the American airhead in the Atsugi area. This advance group was followed 3 hours later by 38 troop transports carrying protective combat forces and necessary supplies of gasoline, oil, and other equipment. The main phase of the airborne operation began at dawn on the 30th of August. The first plane, bearing a regular 40-man load, touched the runway at 0600. Practically every 3 minutes thereafter, throughout the day, American planes landed on the huge Japanese airfield, gliding down with clockwork precision and without a single mishap. By evening, 4,200 combat-equipped troops of the 11th Airborne were on the ground and strategically deployed to protect the airhead against any eventuality. It was a great, though calculated, military gamble. The American elements, outnumbered by thousands to one, were landing in a hostile country where huge numbers of enemy soldiers still had access to their arms. The occupation plan was predicated upon the ability of the emperor to maintain psychological control over his people and to quell any recalcitrant elements. It was doubtful that the majority of the Japanese people would disobey the imperial command to surrender peaceably, but the possibility that certain dissident extremists would forcibly oppose the occupation despite all orders had to be carefully considered. In view of the unpredictable reactions of the Japanese troops, General Eichelberger flew into Atsugi early the first day to take personal command of the situation and to make preparations for the arrival of the Supreme Commander. Fortunately, all apprehensions proved groundless. There was no trouble, not a sign of resistance was apparent. The Japanese had stationed picked and trusted troops around the field and along the main roads of egress to provide security for the greatly outnumbered American soldiers. General MacArthur's calculated risk had been well taken. Shortly after 1400, a famous C-54, the name Bataan, in large letters on its nose, circled the field and glided in for a landing. From it stepped General MacArthur, accompanied by General Sutherland and his other staff officers. The Supreme Commander's first words to General Eichelberger and the men of 8th Army and the 11th Airborne Division who greeted him were, "From Melbourne to Tokyo is a long road. It has been a long and hard road, but this looks like the payoff. The surrender plans are going splendidly and completely according to previous arrangements. In all outlying areas, fighting has practically ceased. In this area a week ago, there were 300,000 troops which have been disarmed and demobilized. The Japanese seem to be acting in complete good faith. There is every hope of the success of the capitulation without undue friction and without unnecessary bloodshed. The entire operation proceeded smoothly. General MacArthur paused momentarily to inspect the airfield, then stepped into a waiting automobile for the drive to Yokohama. Thousands of Japanese troops were posted along the 15 miles of road from Atsugi to Yokohama to guard the route of the Allied motor cavalcade as it proceeded to the temporary SCAP headquarters in Japan's great seaport city. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, including the British warships, steamed into Japan's coastal waters and anchored in Sagami Bay on the 27th. Japanese naval officers met the incoming fleet units to receive instructions for the safe entry of the Allied fleet into Tokyo Bay, in accordance with General MacArthur's surrender directives. On the 29th of August, the Third Fleet moved forward into Tokyo Bay to prepare for the landings at Yokosuka. As the 11th Airborne poured into Atsugi Airfield, troops of the 4th Marine Regimental Combat Team, 6th Marine Division, went ashore at Yokosuka Naval Base on the west bank of Tokyo Bay below Yokohama. Immediately after the airborne landing, elements of the 188th Parachute Glider Regiment sped to Yokohama to take control of the huge dock area. Other patrols of the airborne unit fanned out to the south and contacted troops of the 4th Marines, whose landing was also completed without incident. The Marine Regiment passed to the control of the commanding general, 8th Army, immediately after it disembarked. The intensive preparation and excitement that attended these first landings on the Japanese mainland did not interfere with the mission of affording relief and rescue to the unfortunate Allied personnel already inside Japan as internees or prisoners. Despite the bad weather that delayed the occupation operation, units of the Far East Air Forces and planes from the Third Fleet continued their surveillance missions. On the 25th of August, they began dropping relief supplies of food, medicine and clothing to Allied soldiers and civilians in prisoner of war and internment camps throughout the main islands. While the advance echelon of the occupation forces was still on Okinawa, mercy teams were organized to accompany the first elements of 8th Army Headquarters DOT, and by the representatives of the other United Nations present, General Xu Yongchang for China, ADM Sir Bruce Fraser for the United Kingdom, Lieutenant General Kuzma N. Derevyanko for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, General Sir Thomas A. Blarney for Australia, Colonel L. Moore Cosgrave for Canada, General Jacques P. Leclerc for France, ADM Conrad L. Helfrich for the Netherlands, Air Vice Marshal Leonard M. Isitt for New Zealand. The instrument of surrender was completely signed within 20 minutes. Plate number 132. The first signature of the Japanese delegation was affixed at 0904. General MacArthur wrote his name at 0910, and the last of the Allied representatives signed at 0920. The Japanese envoys then received their copy of the surrender document, bowed stiffly, and departed for Tokyo. Simultaneously, hundreds of Army and Navy planes roared low over the Missouri in one last display of massed air might. In signing the instrument of surrender, the Japanese bound themselves to accept the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration, to surrender unconditionally their armed forces wherever located, to liberate all internees and prisoners of war, and to carry out all orders issued by the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers to effectuate the terms of surrender. On that same eventful day, the Supreme Commander broadcast a report to the people of the United States. Having been associated with Pacific events since the Russo-Japanese War, General MacArthur was able to speak with the authority of long experience to forecast a future for Japan. We stand in Tokyo today reminiscent of our instrument of surrender, by command of and on behalf of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. I accept the provisions set forth in the declaration issued by the heads of the governments of the United States, China, and Great Britain on the 26th of July 1945 at Potsdam, and subsequently adhered to by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which four powers are hereinafter referred to as the Allied Powers. We hereby proclaim the unconditional surrender to the Allied Powers of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters and of all Japanese armed forces and all forces under Japanese control, wherever situated. We hereby command the Japanese forces to cease hostilities forthwith, to withdraw and save from damage all ships, aircraft, and military and civil property, and to comply with all requirements which may be imposed by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers or by agencies of the Japanese government at his direction. We hereby command the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to issue at once orders to the commanders of all Japanese forces and all forces under Japanese control, wherever situated, to surrender unconditionally themselves and all forces under their control. We hereby command all civil, military, and naval officials to obey and enforce all proclamations, orders, and directives deemed by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers to be proper to effectuate this surrender and issued by him or under his authority, and we direct all such officials to remain at their posts and to continue to perform their non-combatant duties unless specifically relieved by him or under his authority. We hereby undertake for the Emperor, the Japanese government, and their successors to carry out the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration in good faith, and to issue whatever orders and take whatever action may be required by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers or by any other designated representative of the Allied Powers for the purpose of giving effect to that declaration. We hereby command the Japanese Imperial Government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to liberate all Allied prisoners of war and civilian internees now under Japanese control, and to provide for their protection, care, maintenance, and immediate transportation to places as directed. The authority of the Emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the terms of surrender. Commodore Perry, 92 years ago, sought to bring to Japan an era of enlightenment and progress by lifting the veil of isolation to the friendship, trade, and commerce of the world. But alas, the knowledge thereby gained of Western science was forged into an instrument of oppression and human enslavement. Freedom of expression, freedom of action, and even freedom of thought were denied through supervision of liberal education, through appeals to superstition, and through the application of force. We are committed by the Potsdam Declaration of Principles to see that the Japanese people are liberated from this condition of slavery. It is my purpose to implement this commitment just as rapidly as the armed forces are demobilized and other essential steps taken to neutralize the war potential. The energy of the Japanese race, if properly directed, will enable expansion vertically rather than horizontally. If the talents of the race are turned into constructive channels, the country can lift itself from its present deplorable state into a position of dignity. Immediately following the signing of the surrender articles, the Imperial Proclamation of Capitulation was issued. The proclamation, the draft of which had been given to General Kawabe at Manila, read as follows: Accepting the terms set forth in the declaration issued by the heads of the governments of the United States, Great Britain, and China on July 26, 1945 at Potsdam, and subsequently adhered to by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, we have commanded the Japanese Imperial Government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign on our behalf the instrument of surrender presented by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, and to issue general orders to the military and naval forces in accordance with the direction of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. We command all our people forthwith to cease hostilities, to lay down their arms, and faithfully to carry out all the provisions of the instrument of surrender and the general orders issued by the Japanese Imperial Government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters hereinafter. Surrender throughout the SWPA areas. In accordance with the Emperor's proclamation, Japanese army commanders took steps to surrender the millions of their forces in overseas areas. Offensive action by U.S. troops had been suspended on the 15th of August with the announcement of Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. All fighting did not cease, however, since it took many days, and in some cases weeks, for the official word of surrender to be carried along the badly disrupted Japanese communication channels. Various devices were employed by the American commanders to transmit the news of final defeat to the dispersed and isolated enemy troops. Plane-strewn leaflets, loudspeaker broadcasts, strategically placed signboards, and prisoner-of-war volunteers all helped in persuading reluctant Japanese to submit themselves peaceably in conformity with the imperial rescript. General MacArthur ordered General Steyer, commanding the army forces of the Western Pacific, to receive the surrender of the Japanese units remaining in the Philippines. Rounding up the remaining enemy forces, however, was not a simple task. The remnants of the enemy scattered throughout the islands were split into a number of independent groups, all of which were operating from the comparative security of the mountainous terrain of the interior. Although these troops doggedly attempted to continue fighting, their resistance was disorganized and relatively ineffective. Malnutrition, disease, and improperly treated wounds had sapped their strength and taken a high toll in lives. On Luzon, the largest group of Japanese was concentrated around Kiangan, northeast of Baguio, fighting stubbornly in what had come to be called the Yamashita Pocket. In this sector, General Yamashita still held forth in command of the remaining forces of the 14th Area Army, now reduced to a conglomeration of sick and wounded military elements, civilian employees, and refugees, totaling about 40,000 men. In the Sierra Madre Mountains, east of the Cagayan Valley, in the Zambales Mountains of Bataan, and in the dense areas of southern Luzon, thousands continued to struggle for survival. The jungles of Negros and Cebu and the wilds of Zamboanga and Mindanao provided temporary sanctuary for additional Japanese who roamed the islands of the south. In British New Guinea, VJ Day found the Australian 6th Division pushing some 8,000 of the enemy out of the WWII area southward across the Sepik River. In Bougainville, an estimated 13,000 enemy troops were compressed into the southern coastal areas by the Australian 3rd Division, while another group of about 6,000 held out along the Buin Road in the south. In New Britain, approximately 47,000 Japanese were gathered at the tip of the Gazelle Peninsula. In Borneo, most of the enemy units had retreated into the hills and jungles, leaving the Australian 7th Division to occupy the cities along the coasts. In most cases, steps towards surrender took place as soon as the local Japanese commanders heard the Emperor's proclamation by radio. On Mindanao, the commanding officer of 4,000 Air Force personnel in the mountains about 30 miles east of Valencia in central Bukidnon province began immediate negotiations to turn over his troops. Rear ADM Takasue Furuse, in command of 1,500 Japanese naval personnel in the Infanta area of southern Luzon, initiated surrender talks with a guerrilla organization. Japanese forces on Bataan agreed to turn over their arms on the 1st of September, while the enemy commander in the Cagayan Valley, Major General Shintaro Yaguchi, signified that he would surrender his remaining units as soon as he received word from General Yamashita. Colonel Matsui, commander of Japanese forces in the southern part of the Cagayan Valley, arranged to turn over his men to the U.S. 27th Division on the 2nd of September. Another enemy force, numbering more than 2,300 on the island of Cebu, agreed to surrender to U.S. troops at 12 o'clock noon, 3 September. Surrender ceremony, Philippines. On the 3rd of September, General Steyer ordered the 1st Cavalry Division to establish contact with the Japanese on Mindanao and in the Visayas. Over the next few days, numerous formal surrender ceremonies were held throughout the archipelago. The first formal surrender took place at 0900 on the 3rd of September at a place called Buntag, near the town of Cagayan de Oro. The local commander, Major General Ishimaru, and approximately 800 officers and men turned themselves over to the Americans without resistance. Within 24 hours, 3 more surrenders took place at Zamboanga, Cebu, and Leyte, while the Japanese in northern Luzon finally ceased hostilities when the commander of the 11th Division surrendered to General Steyer on the 4th of September. In the south, the Japanese commander at Davao agreed to surrender at noon on the 4th of September. Following a massive aerial bombardment of Japanese fortifications in the area, a heavy naval bombardment was launched on the 5th of September by U.S. naval vessels. Shortly thereafter, General Steyer announced the formal surrender of Japanese forces in the southern Philippines. The last major Japanese forces to surrender in the Philippines were those trapped in the Yamashita Pocket. In the early morning hours of the 10th of September, General Steyer was notified by Major General Ishimaru that he would accept the terms of surrender. At 1500 that same day, a formal ceremony was held at the surrender area on the summit of Mount Julu, where representatives of the Japanese forces formally delivered their swords and colours to General Steyer. By the 16th of September, General MacArthur announced that the last organised Japanese resistance in the Philippines had ended. The Japanese had lost over 500,000 men during the campaign, with more than 90,000 of their forces surrendering and being taken prisoner, which, by the middle of August, had fought to within a few miles of General Yamashita's last stronghold. A second letter was dropped the following day, directing General Yamashita to send a representative for the purpose of arranging the surrender of the Japanese forces which he controlled. The Japanese representative arrived at a 32nd Division outpost near Kiangan on the 26th of August, with a letter from General Yamashita addressed to General Gill. Acknowledging the receipt of the two previous messages, General Yamashita stated that although he had received and transmitted an order to cease hostilities, he was without authority to surrender his troops until he was formally notified of the signing of the general surrender in Tokyo. Further exchanges of messages, aided by an air-ground radio at the Japanese headquarters, indicated General Yamashita's willingness to send representatives to Baguio in about 5 days to make preliminary negotiations for the surrender of his 40,000 men in northwestern Luzon, more than 1/3 of whom, he declared, were either sick or wounded. This proposal was rejected, however, because of the excessive delay it would cause before the final terms could be agreed upon. General Yamashita finally radioed to a liaison plane circling above his headquarters that he would meet American parties in Kiangan on the 2nd of September and that he would be ready to proceed to Baguio to sign surrender papers for the Japanese military forces in the Philippines. At 0900 on the 2nd of September, General Yamashita, together with his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Akira Muto, and other staff officers, delivered themselves to an escort of the 32nd Division near Kiangan. A second party, consisting of naval personnel under Vice ADM, Denichi Okochi, also appeared on the scene to negotiate the surrender of the naval personnel in that area. From Kiangan, the Japanese were transported by motor vehicle to Bagabag Airfield, where a C-47 transport plane waited to take them to Baguio. General Steyer, who had attended the general surrender ceremony in Tokyo, flew back to the Philippines on the morning of the 3rd of September, accompanied by General Wainwright and General Percival. At noon, the American and Japanese officers gathered in the former residence of the U.S. High Commissioner at Camp John Hay, Baguio. General Steyer opened the conference with a terse statement of purpose. "We are gathered here today to consummate the surrender of the Japanese armed forces in the Philippines. I shall ask my Chief of Staff, General Levy, to commence the proceedings." Major General Edmund H. Levy directed that the instrument of surrender be read, and then the necessary documents were signed by General Yamashita and Admiral Okochi at 12:10 on the 3rd. General Levy thereupon affixed his own signature, after which he announced the official acceptance of the surrender and the conclusion of the surrender ceremonies. 3 hours later, the Japanese delegates were flown to Nielsen Airfield in Manila, and then sent immediately to New Bilibid Prison, 16 miles south of the city, for internment. With General Yamashita's capitulation, subordinate commanders began turning over their forces in rapidly increasing numbers. On Cebu, 2,900 surrendered. Another 1,400 gave themselves up on Negros. Local Japanese commanders on Mindanao began negotiations to surrender 4,000 troops in Davao Province, 2,000 in the Agusan Valley, and over 1,000 Air Force personnel in the mountains northwest of Davao. The long and brutal fighting in the Philippines was finished. An army of close to 500,000 Japanese had been overpowered, divided into ineffective remnants, and virtually annihilated. So completely cut off and separated had the various enemy units become that, for another year after the general surrender, patrols of the United States and the Philippine armies continued to bring in straggling troops who had been unaware that their country had capitulated. On tiny Corregidor Island, 20 Japanese who had been hiding in a great jungle-filled ravine along the steep South Shore cliffs did not surrender until the 1st of January 1946. In other Pacific areas, the first large-scale surrender of Japanese forces came on the 27th of August, when Lieutenant General Yoshio Ishii surrendered Morotai and Halmahera to the U.S. 93rd Division. Capitulation of Japanese units in the remaining parts of the Asiatic Pacific Theater followed in quick succession. In the Marianas, the Japanese commanders on Rota and Pagan Islands relinquished their commands almost simultaneously with the Tokyo Bay ceremony. While General Yamashita was yielding his Philippine Islands forces on the 3rd of September, other Japanese garrisons were being surrendered in the Bonins, on Wake Island, in the Palaus, and at Truk in the Carolines, as well as at Hong Kong on the South China coast. Japanese commanding officers on Aquijan, Ajiguan, islands in the Marianas, and on Jaluit Atoll in the Marshalls surrendered on the 4th of September, as did the Japanese on Ocean and Nauru Islands to the west of the Gilberts. The same day, Japanese forces at Singapore surrendered to the British aboard a warship in the harbour. On the 5th of September, Ulithi Atoll and the Yap garrison in the Carolines capitulated. The overall surrender of Japanese forces in the Solomons and Bismarcks and in the Wewak area of New Guinea was signed on the 6th of September by General Hitoshi Imamura on a British warship off Rabaul, once the centre of Japanese power in the South Pacific. Japanese naval and army forces in the Ryukyus officially capitulated on the 7th of September at the headquarters of General Joseph E. Stilwell's 10th Army on Okinawa. On the same day, the enemy forces on the island of Kusai gave up. In Borneo, Japanese forces in the southeast surrendered at Balikpapan on the 8th, while those in the northwest followed suit at Brunei Bay the following day. The official capitulation of all the Japanese in the China Theatre took place on the morning of the 9th of September at the Central Military Academy in Nanking. The surrender by Yasuji Okamura, commander of Japanese expeditionary forces in China, included Japanese forces in China, Formosa, and northern Indochina, but not in Manchuria. That same afternoon, at the government central building in Seoul, Korea, Lieutenant General Yoshio Kotsuki, commanding the Japanese 17th Area Army and Vice ADM, Gizaburo Yamaguchi, commandant of the Chinkai Guard District, together with the Japanese Governor-General, Nobuyuki Abe, surrendered all Japanese forces in Korea south of the 38-degree parallel to Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, commanding general of the Tortor Corps, and Admiral Kincaid, commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet. Forces north of the 38-degree line were to be surrendered to the Russian commander. On the same day, at Morotai, General Blamy, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian military forces, accepted from Lieutenant General Fusataro Teshima, commanding the Japanese Second Army, the surrender of all enemy forces remaining in Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies east of Lombok Island. On the 10th of September, Votia Atoll and Malaylap in the Marshalls capitulated. The next day, Timor just north of Australia, Ponape in the Carolines, and the remaining Japanese forces on the New Guinea mainland surrendered. Formal surrender of all Southeast Asia, the Netherlands East Indies, and the various islands to the east was signed on the 12th at Singapore by Lieutenant General Seishiro Itagaki, who was in command of the forces at Singapore and deputy commander of the Southern Area Command. The signing of the surrender aboard the Missouri on the 2nd of September marked the end of the long and hard road to Tokyo. Japan was defeated, her armies had surrendered, and her cities were being occupied. World War II was over. As the Allied forces were disembarking from the hundreds of ships that lined Tokyo Bay to take up their duties of occupation, General MacArthur broadcast the announcement of peace to the world. His words expressed the thoughts of one who had felt both the bitterness of defeat and the gratification of victory, who knew well the horrors of warfare and the futility of attempting to achieve peace by resorting to the sword. Today the guns are silent, A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won. As I look back upon the long, tortuous trail from those grim days of Bataan and Corregidor, when an entire world lived in fear, when democracy was on the defensive everywhere, when modern civilization trembled in the balance, I thank a merciful God that He has given us the faith, the courage, and the power from which to mould victory. We have known the bitterness of defeat and the exultation of triumph, and from both we have learned there can be no turning back. We must go forward to preserve in peace what we won in war. A new era is upon us. Even the lesson of victory itself brings with it profound concern, both for our future security and the survival of civilization. The destructiveness of war, potent through progressive advances in scientific discovery, has in fact now reached a point that redefines the traditional concept of war. Men since the beginning of time have sought peace. Various methods through the ages have been attempted to devise an international process to prevent or settle disputes between nations. From the very start, workable methods were found so far as individual citizens were concerned, but the mechanics of an instrumentality of large international scope have never been successful. Military alliances, balances of power, leagues of nations, all in turn failed, leading the only path to be by way of the crucible of war. The utter destructiveness of war now blots out this alternative. We have had our last chance. If we do not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. The problem basically is theological and involves a spiritual recrudescence and improvement of human character that will synchronize with our almost matchless advance in science, art, literature, and all material and cultural developments of the past 2,000 years. It must be of the spirit if we are to save the flesh.